The wind came first across the Dakota Territory in the late summer of 1883, not as a sound, but as a presence bending the grass in long silver waves that rolled toward the horizon, like water that had forgotten how to be still. Beneath that endless sky, a woman bent her back against a rope, and the rope bit into her shoulder through the worn cloth of her dress, and she pulled. Behind her, lashed to a stone sled of rough-hewn timber, a slab of gray granite the size of a coffin lid dragged a furrow into the prairie soil. The ox ahead of her leaned into its yoke ribs, showing through a dull hide breath, laboring in the dry heat. Mina Hale did not stop. She had learned long ago that the moment a body stopped, the weight settled in and made the next step harder, and so she kept moving one boot in front of the other, dragging the bones of a house out of ground that other people only cursed. They were stones. The homesteaders despised the field rock that broke plow blades and turned good furrows into wreckage, the granite that men hauled to the edges of their claims and dumped in heaps to rot under the weather. Mina gathered them as though they were gold. She had been at it for weeks now, each trip a small ordeal, each slab pried from the dirt with an iron bar, and the patience of someone who had nowhere easier to be. She had a system to it, though no one watching could have seen the sense in it. She read the ground for the flat-faced stones, the ones that would lie true against their neighbors, and she left the rounded boulders where they sat, because a rounded stone was a quarrel waiting to happen in a wall. She had learned to judge the heft of a slab by the way the grass grew around it, to know before she set the bar whether it would come free clean or fight her for an hour. Her father had taught her that in another country, and she had not known then that the knowing would one day stand between her children and the grave. Two children trailed behind the sled, gathering the smaller chips and loose stones into a willow basket, their faces sunburned and serious. Ada was 7, old enough to understand that her mother was building something that made the neighbors laugh. Sam was 4, too young to understand anything except that the stones were heavy and the days were long, and his mother's hands had gone hard as the rock she carried. The girl worked without being told the way a child works, who has learned that the family is short, one pair of hands, and that the missing hands will not be coming back. The boy worked the way a boy of 4 works, in bursts, distracted by a beetle or a hawk, and his mother let him because she meant for at least one of her children to remember this summer as something other than labor. On the rutted road that passed beside her quarter section, the wagons slowed. They always slowed. Men driving their teams toward the trading post would draw the reins back and sit a moment watching the widow Hale drag her impossible cargo across the open ground, and their faces wore the particular expression that frontier people reserve for a thing they had judged and found wanting. It was not cruelty exactly. It was pity wearing the mask of certainty. They saw a woman alone with 2 small children, and instead of raising a sensible cabin of logs, the way any reasonable soul would, she was laying the foundation for something vast, something squat and monstrous, walls that would swallow a fortune in labor and give back nothing but a tomb beneath the wide and indifferent heavens. What manner of woman, the men asked one another over the counter at the post hall's stone like a draft animal when there is good straight timber to be had. What folly drove her to refuse the wisdom that every settler in the valley had paid for in cold and hunger? They did not know that her hands carried the marks of a particular trade, that the calluses across her palms had been earned not at a washboard, but at a chisel, and that she had been pulling stone out of the earth since she was a girl in the Blue Hills of West Virginia, where her people had cut and set rock for longer than any of them could rightly count. They saw only the strangeness of it. They named the strangeness before they understood it, and the name they gave it spread through the valley like a grass fire. They called it Hale's Folly. The richest man in that stretch of territory was a merchant named Harlan Brooks, and Harlan Brooks owned the largest cabin in the valley, a sprawling structure of milled lumber freighted in at great expense from the railhead 16 miles distant. He had glass in every window and a porch that ran the length of the front, and he had built it to be seen which it was. He held the note on half the claims in the district and the goodwill of the other half, and he wore his prosperity the way some men wear a fine hat, tilted a little so that no one could miss it. He came past Mina's claim one afternoon on a fine bay horse, reined up at the edge of the road, and looked down at her with the easy contempt of a man who had never once doubted his own footing in the world. He told her in a voice pitched to carry to the others who had gathered that she was wasting the best years of her children's lives on a pile of rocks. He told her that a sensible widow would have sold the claim and taken honest work in town. He told her that stone was for graveyards and foundations, not for the living. Then he touched his hat in a gesture that was meant to look like courtesy and meant nothing of the kind. And he rode on toward his warm and handsome house, and Mina watched him go without answering, because she had learned that some men spend words the way they spend everything, to be admired for the spending. She straightened her spine when he was gone. The ache in her shoulders had become a constant companion, a thing she carried alongside the grief that never quite left her. And she looked at the low courses of stone already laid into the prairie, and let herself remember for a moment the man who should have been standing beside her. Samuel Hale had been a stonemason as his father had been before him in a valley of the Appalachians, where the winters came down hard off the ridges and the mountain rock held a cold that could crack a careless man's bones. But the houses they raised there were not miserable places. They were structures of fitted stone, some of them older than memory, and inside them the warmth held deep and steady through the worst of the season. Samuel had courted her with his hands as much as his words, showing her how a wall was more than a barrier, how the right stone set the right way would drink the heat of a fire and give it back slow across the long dark hours. He had taught her the saying his own father had taught him, the one she heard now in the rasp of the wind across the grass. Wood warms you once when it burns. Stone warms you all winter long. They had meant to build such a house together on the open land of the new territory, where a person could claim a quarter section and make a life that belonged to no landlord and no mine. They had talked of it on the porch of her father's house through a whole autumn, the two of them young and certain, drawing the floor plan with a charred stick on a board until the board was black with their dreaming. Samuel had wanted a hearth at the heart of it, a great stone hearth that would warm the whole house through, and Mina had wanted windows, real windows with real glass, because she had grown up in a house with one small dim window, and she had promised herself that her children would have light. They had loaded their wagon at last and turned their faces west with the children and a chest of mason's tools and a head full of plans. And for the first weeks of it, the journey had felt like the beginning of everything they had spoken of on that porch. Samuel had taken the fever somewhere along the Missouri, the kind that came on in a single night and took a strong man down inside a week. She had nursed him in the back of the wagon while the wheels turned and the country rolled past indifferent, and she had watched the strength go out of the hands that had taught her everything she knew. And on the sixth night, he had asked her in a voice already half gone to finish the house anyway, to give the children the hearth and the windows both. She had promised him because there was nothing else to give a dying man, and she had not understood until later that the promise would become the spine of the rest of her life. She buried him in ground she would never see again, a low mound under a cottonwood that some other traveler had marked with a cairn of river stones, and she set one of her own flat stones at his head and cut his name into it with a chisel by firelight, because she was a mason and it was the only headstone she knew how to make. Then she climbed back onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, because turning back was a luxury she could not afford, and stopping was a thing she did not know how to do. She had arrived at the claim a widow with 2 children and a wagon full of tools, and she had set down her grief the only way she knew how, which was to pick up the work he had left undone. So when the men laughed, it did not touch her the way they imagined. She was not building a pile of rocks. She was keeping a promise made to a dying man under a cottonwood tree, and she was doing it with the knowledge he had poured into her across the years. And if she failed, it would not be because she was a fool. It would be because the ground itself had decided against her. That thought did not comfort her. It frightened her in the small hours more than she would have admitted to any living soul. For there were nights when the certainty drained out of her like water through sand. She would lie in the sod shelter that served them now, the temporary burrow of cut turf she had thrown up against the first cold, with Ada and Sam breathing slow beside her, and she would do the arithmetic that no widow with 2 children should ever have to do. The money was nearly gone. The chest of coins Samuel had saved against this very venture had paid for the ox, the glass, the iron, the freight, and what remained would not carry them through a winter if the winter found them unsheltered. The season was turning. If the house failed, there would be no time to build another, and no fuel laid by to survive the failure, and the men who pitied her now would gather at her grave and shake their heads and say they had told her so. She believed in the stone. She had felt it work with her own body in the houses of her childhood. But belief, she had learned, was a thin garment to wear against a Dakota winter, and there were hours before dawn when she shivered in it and wondered if grief had unmoored her judgment if she had carried a dead man's dream too far into a country that had no use for it. The work itself was a thing she could lose herself inside, and there were days she was grateful for that, for the way the labor crowded out the fear. Before she could set a single stone in the wall, she had to make the mortar, and to make the mortar she had to make the lime, and to make the lime she had built herself a kiln out of the very field rock she was gathering, a rough domed thing dug half into a south-facing bank. She fed it with wood she could ill afford to burn, and limestone she hauled from an outcrop 2 miles off, and she tended it through a day and a night while it cooked the stone down to a fierce white powder that would bite the skin from a careless hand. She had watched her father do this 100 times, and she had done it herself perhaps a dozen, and the doing of it alone with no one to spell her at the fire and no one to warn her. When the burn ran too hot taught her things about her own endurance she had not wished to know. She slaked the lime in a pit lined with her precious lumber scraps, standing back from the boil of it as it hissed and steamed and threw its caustic breath into the air, and when it had cooled to a smooth gray putty, she folded in the sand she had sifted from the creek bank, and the result was a mortar that would hold her walls together long after she was dust. The men who laughed at her did not know how to burn lime. They bought their little they needed from Harlan Brooks, who freighted it in. Mina made her own because making her own was the difference between a house she could afford and a house she could only dream of. And she had stopped somewhere on the trail west, being a woman who could afford to dream. The cold in this place was the heart of the matter, and to call it merely cold was to insult its ambition. It was not a season. It was a hunting thing, patient and malign, and it came down off the northern plains with nothing to slow it. No mountains, no forests, only the flat, unbroken miles that let it gather speed and hunger as it ran. The settlers knew it was coming the way animals know, by a change in the slant of the light, by the way the sun at its highest seemed to give nothing back, a pale coin pinned to a hard sky. They prepared the way they had been taught, the way the generation before them had prepared by raising cabins of logs and chinking the gaps with clay and straw and moss, and they believed in those cabins, the way Mina believed in her stone because the belief had been handed down, and the handing down felt like wisdom. A man whose father had survived a winter in a log cabin did not question the log cabin. He questioned the man who built in stone. The finest builder of such cabins in that district was a man named Eli Caldwell, and Eli Caldwell had earned every ounce of the respect the valley gave him. He had raised more than half the dwellings in the area, and he could put up a cabin in 7 days that was snug and square and honest. The corners notched so clean they looked machined, the logs chosen for straightness and heft, and laid up into walls that held together like a single grain of wood. He was a man near 50, weathered and deliberate, with the unshakable conviction of someone whose craft has never once betrayed him. He had come to the territory as a young man with an axe and a reputation already forming, and he had spent 30 years confirming it, and there was not a family in the valley that did not owe some part of its shelter to his hands. His own family lived in the best house he had ever built, and he regarded the Widow Hale's project with the discomfort of a man watching a stranger walk knowingly toward a cliff. He had said nothing for weeks. He was not a man who relished interference. But the longer the strange stone walls climbed out of the prairie, the more it gnawed at him, until at last his conscience would not let him keep his peace. He rode out one cool afternoon when the first hard frost had silvered the grass, dismounted, and crossed the churned ground to where Mina was setting a course of stone into a bed of the mortar she had burned herself. He greeted her with more concern than scorn, because whatever else he believed, he did not believe she deserved to suffer for her stubbornness. He had watched her work, he told her. He did not wish to intrude, but he felt he had to speak. He gestured at the walls with a hand grown thick from the weight of an axe, and the worry in him came out plain. These walls were stone, he told her, dense with moisture from the ground. The moment she lit a fire inside, the heat would strike that frozen rock, and the water would weep down the inside faces, and her house would turn damp. A frozen cave for the whole of the season. It was a sound argument built on practical experience with stone cellars and stone foundations, the kind of knowledge that had been earned in cold ground, and he laid it out the way a man lays out a thing he is sure of plainly, without heat, expecting agreement. Mina set down her trowel and wiped the grit from her hands against her apron. "The inner wall will not be cold," she said simply, her voice carrying the soft mountain cadence she had never lost. Caldwell frowned, not understanding. His eye traveled the strange line of the construction, and the worst of it, the thing he could not abide, was the gap. She was not raising one wall. She was raising an outer course of the largest, flattest fieldstones she could find, near 2 feet thick, and inside it a second thinner wall of smaller stone, with a hollow void of perhaps 6 inches running between them around the whole circumference of the dwelling. He pointed at the emptiness as though it were a wound. This hollow, he pressed her. She was building a home for rats and a highway for drafts. The wind would find that void and pour through it a river of cold air circling her family all winter long. It defeated the entire purpose of a heavy wall. The air is not for drafts, she answered, her composure unbroken. The air is the insulation. He shook his head. He had seen enough. This was not merely unorthodox. It was wrong, and it ran against every principle of building that this brutal country had taught him. And the room, he said, his voice rising with the frustration of a man whose generosity was being spent on deaf ground. She was sacrificing a quarter of her living space to the stone. She would have a fortress on the outside and a closet on the inside. She would labor herself to ruin for a house that would be cold and damp and cramped, and her children would pay the price for a notion she had carried from somewhere else and could not let go. Mina Hale looked at this respected man, this builder of honest reputation and honorable intent, and then her gaze went past him to the rising walls of her own strange house, and beyond them to the low sod shelter where her children waited. She gave him the only answer she found worth giving. "My children will be warm," she said. "That is all I am building." And there was no anger in it, no defiance, even only a certainty so quiet that it unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it sounded less like opinion than like memory. Caldwell rode away convinced she was a stubborn fool, and he carried the conviction back to the trading post and laid it out for the others, not from malice, but as a warning, the considered verdict of the one man whose word on building no one in the valley would dispute. He did not gloat over it. He spoke of it the way a doctor speaks of a patient who will not take the cure with a heaviness, because he liked the widow well enough and admired her grit, even as he mourned what her grit would cost her. But his professional judgment hardened the community's pity into something closer to certainty, and the project that had been merely foolish became in the telling dangerously so. The name Hale's Folly took deeper root. Children repeated it. The men said it without thinking. It became the thing the place was called, so that a stranger asking directions would be told to turn left past the folly, and the stranger would nod as though that explained anything at all. But the certainty did not sit easy in Eli Caldwell as he rode home through the dying light. He had said his peace had been refused, had washed his hands of it the way a sensible man does. And yet there was something in the widow's calm that snagged on the edge of his mind like a splinter he could not work loose. She had not argued like a fool. She had not pleaded ignorance or thrown up her hands. She had spoken about that hollow void the way he himself spoke about a notched corner, with the easy authority of someone who had done a thing 100 times and watched it work. He told himself it was the confidence of the deluded that the most dangerous error always wore the face of conviction. He told himself she had simply learned her stubbornness somewhere far away and could not see how this country differed. But that night, for the first time in more years than he could number, Eli Caldwell lay awake and turned a question over that he did not want to hold. What if the strange woman with the mason's hands knew something he did not? He pushed the thought down. He had built half the valley. He could not afford to entertain it, but it did not entirely leave him, and he slept poorly, and he did not know why. The autumn deepened, and Mina pressed on with a singleness of purpose that fed the talk and starved the gossip of nothing. She filled the 6-inch void between the stone walls not with rats and drafts, but with dry moss and straw, packing it down by hand into a thick and resilient layer course by course as the walls rose. It was slow fiddly work, the kind that no one would ever see once the house was finished, and there were days she resented the hours it stole from the more visible labor of setting stone. But she had felt with her own body the difference such a layer made, and she knew that the unseen work was the work that mattered, that the parts of a house a person never noticed were precisely the parts that kept that person alive. She was building a wall of many parts, an outer mass of stone to hold the heat, a middle layer to break the cold, an inner mass of stone to hold the warmth and give it back. The men who came on Sunday afternoons to watch the peculiar work could make no sense of it. They saw waste where she saw design. They saw a void where she saw a shield. And she let them watch, and she did not explain, because explaining had gotten her nowhere with Caldwell, and the only argument she trusted was the one the winner would settle. She raised a central hearth next a true fireplace of generous proportion, And into its body she worked a thing that none of the watchers understood, for she did not run the flue straight up to vent the smoke into the sky the way every chimney they had ever known was built. She turned it. She led the chimney through the heart of the masonry along a winding serpentine passage so that the smoke and the heated gases could not rush up and out and carry their warmth away with them. Instead, they were forced to travel the long road through the stone, surrendering their heat into the mass of it before they were ever released. It was the most difficult part of the whole construction, the part that demanded the most of her memory, and her craft for a flue built wrong would not draw at all, and would fill the house with smoke and kill the family as surely as the cold. She built it slow, testing the draft with a handful of dry grass set alight, watching the way the smoke pulled through the turns, undoing and rebuilding a section twice until it ran true. It was a thing she had seen her father build into the great hearths of her childhood, and she built it now from memory, her hands finding the angles the way another woman's hands might find the steps of a dance learned young. The floor she would not lay flat upon the cold ground. She raised it, leaving a crawl space beneath, and into that hollow she set a duct carefully shaped that ran from a low opening in the south-facing outer wall to the foundation of the hearth. The house was made to breathe, but only under her direction, only along the path she chose. Fresh air would enter from outside through that sealed channel, and being cold and heavy, it would travel beneath the floor, and as it neared the great warm base of the fire, it would begin to take on heat, and that warmed air, and only that air would be drawn up to feed the flames. No raw cold would spill across the floor where her children played. No icy river would pour through the room to feed a hungry fire, the way it did in every chink cabin in the valley, where the blaze sucked the frozen air in through 100 cracks to keep itself alive. Her house would draw its breath through a lung of its own making, and it would warm that breath before it ever reached the living. She had to explain none of this to herself in such words, for she had no such words, but she understood it the way a sailor understands the wind, in the body, in the hands, and a knowledge older than the naming of things. She worked until the light failed each day, and she worked through aches that would have stopped a larger person, and the children helped where small hands could help and slept where they could not. There were evenings she sat alone after they had gone down, looking at the dark shape of the thing she was making against the last green of the western sky, and the fear came up in her, then sharp and cold as the season approaching. She had spent nearly everything. The walls were not yet roofed. If an early storm caught her with the house open to the sky, the whole of it would be for nothing, and her children would face the killing months in a burrow of sod. She did the arithmetic again, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, and the arithmetic frightened her, and she went on anyway because the alternative was to admit that Harlan Brooks and Eli Caldwell and the whole Laughing Valley had been right, and that she could not do. Not while there was breath in her and stone in the ground. The frost came harder now, and the men at the trading post laid their bets in the language of pity, wagering how soon the widow's grand mistake would force her into town with her children and her tail tucked under her. Some gave her until Christmas. Some, more generous, gave her until the first hard storm. None of them gave her the winter. Harlan Brooks made a show of his generosity, letting it be known that he might find a place for her, some work scrubbing or sewing, when the inevitable came. He said it with the warmth of a man who enjoyed being seen to be kind, and the saying of it cost him nothing, and it raised him in the eyes of the men who heard it, which was the whole of its purpose. Mina heard of it through the thin web of frontier talk, and set her jaw and laid another course of stone. She would not scrub Harlan Brooks's floors. She would not give the valley the satisfaction of being right. She would finish the house her husband had dreamed, or she would freeze inside it, and either way she would do it on her own ground. The roof went on as the first true cold arrived, heavy timber she could barely lift, set with the last of her strength in a borrowed block and tackle, in a stubbornness that frightened even her. The block and tackle she had begged from a neighbor, a taciturn old Norwegian named Lund, who lived alone 2 claims over and who had never once laughed at her, perhaps because he spoke too little English to join the laughter, perhaps because he had built things with his own hands in the old country, and knew that a fool and a craftsman can look much alike to those who cannot tell the difference. He had brought the tackle himself and stayed a silent day to help her raise the ridge beam, and he had gone home without a word of his opinion on the house. And she had been grateful, past saying, for the one neighbor who offered help instead of counsel. She sealed the roof tight. She fitted the small, deep windows, set far back into the thick walls, so that they looked out upon the world like the wary eyes of a burrowing creature glazed with the precious pains she had hauled wrapped in straw all the way from the territory's edge. The pains that were Samuel's promise to his children made glass. And then in the last gray week before the snow, the house stood finished. It crouched low against the open prairie squat, and broad and strange a thing that seemed to have grown from the ground rather than been set upon it. Its walls were a yard thick. Its windows were small and deep and watchful. Smoke would rise from a chimney that ran no straight course anyone could see. To every soul in the valley it looked less like a dwelling than a barrow, a heaped grave waiting for its tenant, and they were certain to a person that it would soon become exactly that. They did not know that the thing the widow Hale had built was not a house in the way they meant the word. It was an engine, a patient, silent machine for the gathering and the keeping of warmth, and it had been built by a woman who had buried her teacher on the road and carried his knowledge the rest of the way alone. The first snow came on a windless night near the end of November, falling soft and thick out of a sky gone the color of ash, and Mina stood in the open doorway of her finished house with a child's hand in each of hers and watched the world disappear beneath it. The cold pressed against the threshold, and behind her the hearth she had built threw its first heat into the great body of the stone. And somewhere out in the white dark, the valley slept in its cabins of log, certain in its bones that the strange woman and her children would not see the spring. She felt the fear and the hope braided together in her chest, too tight to pull apart, and she drew her children back inside and shut the heavy door against the falling snow and the long testing of everything she believed had quietly begun. That first night in the finished house, she lay awake not from fear, but from a feeling she had almost forgotten, a cautious and disbelieving comfort. The room held its warmth. She had banked the fire low before she slept, lower than she would have dared in any cabin, and still the air stayed soft, and still the inner wall at her back gave off the faint, even heat of a thing that had been storing the day against the night. She rose once in the small hours and laid her palm against the stone the way her father had taught her, and she felt it answer warm as a loaf an hour out of the oven. And she stood there in the dark a long time, with her hand on the wall, and let herself believe just for that hour that the promise under the cottonwood might yet be kept. Word of the finished folly traveled the valley faster than the snow melted, and the men shook their heads over it at the post, and Eli Caldwell heard the talk and said little, because the splinter was still in his mind, and he did not care to show it. Harlan Brooks laughed and called it a monument to a woman's pride, and ordered another load of cordwood freighted out to his fine lumber house, because a man of his standing did not stint himself on comfort. And the cold drew its first slow breath across the plains, and the light went thin and far, and every chimney in the valley began to smoke against the dark, save one where the smoke rose slow and pale and steady, like the breathing of something patient that had only just begun to wake. The neighbors nearest to Mina's claim were a young couple named Tom and Sarah Whitfield, and they had raised their cabin the spring before, with Eli Caldwell's own hands guiding the work so that it stood as square and tight as any dwelling in the valley. They were not long married, the two of them, and they had come west the way the young come west, with more hope than money, and a faith that hard work would close the gap between the two. They had a baby not yet a year old, a girl they had named Clara after Sarah's mother, and through the thin walls of autumn, Mina could sometimes hear the child crying on the wind, a sound that carried across the open ground and lodged somewhere beneath her ribs, because she had carried children of her own across hard country, and she knew the particular helplessness in the cry of an infant whose mother cannot make the world warm enough. The Whitfields had been kind to her in the small ways that frontier people managed a loaf left on a stump, a hand with the ox when it balked, and they had never once joined the laughter at the post. But they believed in their cabin the way the rest believed in theirs, and when Sarah came walking one frost-bright morning to bring a jar of preserves and stayed to watch Mina pack moss into the void between her walls, the young woman's face showed the same gentle confusion that everyone wore. Sarah turned the jar in her reddened hands and asked with the carefulness of someone who did not wish to give offense whether Mina was not afraid of what the winter would do to a house built so strange. Mina kept her hands moving in the cold mortar and answered that she was afraid of a great many things, and the winter was only one of them. It was the truest thing she had said to anyone in weeks, and Sarah seemed to feel the weight of it because she did not press further. She looked at the children stacking stone chips into their basket, and she looked at the widow's chapped and bleeding knuckles, and something passed across her young face that was not pity. It was closer to fear, the kind that comes when a person glimpses, just for an instant, that the wisdom everyone shares might not be wisdom at all. She had a baby in a cabin with thin walls, and she had spent the autumn telling herself those walls were enough, because the man who built them was the best in the valley. And now a strange woman packing moss into a stone wall had set a small, cold question loose in her that she could not catch and put back. She left the preserves and walked home with her shoulders drawn up against more than the cold. And that night she said something to Tom that he dismissed, and the dismissing of it would matter later, though neither of them could have known. What she said was simple. She said that she wondered if the widow knew something they did not, and Tom, tired from a day of splitting wood, told her that the widow knew how to waste a summer, and that Eli Caldwell knew how to build a house, and that he would trust Caldwell over a notion any day of the week. Sarah let it go because a young wife learns to let things go, but she did not forget it, and the cold question stayed in her, small and patient, waiting for the winter to either answer it or kill it. The early cold came as a rehearsal before the true performance, a snap of bitter days near the start of December that drove the temperature down hard and held it there for the better part of a week. It was nothing to what would follow, but it was enough to teach a lesson to anyone willing to learn it, and the lesson was written first across the faces of the Whitfields. Their tight, square cabin, the pride of Caldwell's craft, drank firewood at a rate that frightened them. The baby caught a cough that rattled in her small chest, and Sarah sat up through the nights with the child against her body and her back turned to the wall because the wall had gone cold as a tombstone, and a film of frost had crept across its inner face by morning. Tom split wood until his hands cracked and bled, and still the heat would not hold, and still the cold found its way in through joints that Caldwell's axe had cut as clean as any in the territory. The cabin was as good as a cabin could be made. That was the terror of it. It was the best the old wisdom could offer, and the best was not enough, and the young couple did not yet have the words to name what they were beginning to suspect. Mina saw the smoke pouring thick and constant from the Whitfield chimney across the White Miles, and she understood it for what it was, a family burning through its winter store in the first week of the season to hold off a cold that would only deepen. She felt no triumph in it. She felt the old grief stir because she had seen this before in a different country, in a different life, and she knew where it led. She remembered a winter in the hills when a neighbor family had burned green wood and wet, having failed to lay by enough seasoned, and how the children of that family had gone hollow-eyed and silent by February, and how the youngest had not seen the spring. She had been a girl then, and she had not understood why her own house stayed warm while theirs did not, and her father had told her it was not luck and not virtue, but stone, only stone, the patient stone that held what the fire gave it. She had warned no one in the valley because no one had asked, and because the one time she had been asked, she had been called a fool for the answer. So she banked her own small fire and watched her children sleep in a room that held its warmth like a closed hand, and she carried the knowledge of her neighbor's suffering as one more stone in a load she had long since stopped expecting to set down. To understand the certainty in Mina Hale's hands, a person would have had to know the hollows of West Virginia, where she had learned them. And that was a country she carried now only in memory, for she would never walk its ridges again. She had been a girl of perhaps 10 when her father first set her to the stone smaller than Ada was now, and he had not coddled her at it because he did not coddle anyone at the work, but he had been patient in the way of a man who loves a craft and wants to see it carried on. He had a way of speaking about rock as though it were a living thing with moods and patience, and he would set her hand on a stone and ask her where it wanted to lie. And at first she had thought it a foolish question, and then slowly over years she had come to understand it, because a stone did have a way it wanted to lie, a face that wanted the light and a face that wanted the dark, and a mason who fought the stone built a wall that fought him back. He had pressed her palm flat against the south wall on a winter evening and bade her feel how it gave back the warmth it had drunk from the day's pale sun. That is the secret he had told her, and his voice came to her now across all the miles and all the years. A fire dies the moment you stop feeding it. But stone remembers. Stone holds what you give it and returns it long after you have forgotten you gave anything at all. She had not understood it as physics then, for she had no such words, but she had understood it in her body the way the old houses of her childhood held a deep and even warmth through the worst of the season, while a neighbor's board shack stood cold as a smokehouse. Samuel had taken all of his own father's craft and added his own art to it, and when he had asked her to marry him, It had been with a trowel still in his hand, and she had said yes over the wall. They were building together, and the wall still stood somewhere in those far hills, warming a family that had never known the two young people who had set its stones. All of that knowledge had ridden west in the wagon with the chest of tools, and all of it had survived the crossing that Samuel had not. There were nights on the trail after she buried him when Mina had wanted nothing more than to turn the team around and carry her children back to the only country she understood. But back there was a sister's crowded cabin and a charity that would have ground her down to nothing. And forward was a quarter section of her own, and the dream they had carried together, and she had chosen forward because Samuel had chosen it, and because a widow who turned back was a widow who admitted she could not stand alone. She had not known those nights whether she was brave or merely too stubborn to grieve properly. She still did not know, but she knew stone, and she knew that the knowledge in her hands was true, even when everything else in her life had proven false, and she had built her house on that one certainty because it was the only solid ground she had left. Ada understood more than her mother knew. The girl was 7, and 7 was old enough to feel the shape of the other children's voices when the families gathered at the post, old enough to know that her mother's house had a name, and the name was a kind of laughing. She had heard a boy call it the rock grave, and she had not told her mother because she had seen how her mother's face went still and far away when the talk reached her, and Ada did not want to put that look there again. She helped instead. She carried the stone chips and packed the moss with her small, cold hands and asked her mother once in the careful way of a child, testing a fear whether the house would really keep them warm or whether the boy at the post was right. Mina had knelt in the half-finished doorway and taken her daughter's face in her two rough hands and told her that the boy at the post had never felt a stone wall give back the sun, and that she had, and that some things a person knew in the body could not be laughed away. Ada had believed her mostly the way children believe a mother because the alternative is unbearable. But she had lain awake too some nights, listening to the wind test the walls, and she had been afraid in the particular way of a child who has glimpsed that the grown people of the world do not agree, and that her own life hangs in the gap between their certainties. Sam was 4 and afraid of nothing, which was its own kind of mercy. He thought the stones were a game, and the house a cave for playing in, and he had named the ox Gus and talked to it through the long days, and he had no notion at all that the valley had condemned his family to a frozen death. His mother was glad of it. She held the boy's fearlessness against her own dread, like a warm thing against the cold, and she let him believe the world was made of adventure, because there would be time enough for him to learn what the world was made of, and she meant to see him grow old enough to learn it. Harlan Brooks came past once more before the deep cold settled, and this time he did not bother to dismount or pitch his voice for an audience, because there was no audience, only the widow setting the last of her window glass with hands wrapped in rags against the frost. He sat his fine horse and looked at the squat finished thing with an expression that had curdled from contempt into something he himself might not have named a faint unease beneath the scorn. He told her the offer of work in town still stood, that he was not a hard man, that he would not see a woman and her children freeze for the sake of foolish pride. And Mina straightened from the window and looked up at him on his tall horse with his coat lined in good wool, and she said that she thanked him for his Christian concern and that she would not be needing it, and that he should mind his own fires when the wind turned. There was nothing sharp in it. There did not need to be. Something in the flatness of her certainty reached up and touched the merchant in a place his money did not protect, and he turned his horse without another word and rode back toward his handsome house. And he found that he was annoyed all out of proportion to the exchange, and he did not care to ask himself why. For the truth that Harlan Brooks would not look at the truth that lived under the floorboards of his contempt was that he had built his great lumber house for the same reason he did everything to be seen and admired and envied. And a house built to be admired is not the same as a house built to keep a child alive. He had glass in every window because glass was dear, and dear things announced a man's success. And he had never once stopped to consider that every pane was a wound through which the warmth would flee on the coldest nights. He had milled lumber freighted at ruinous cost because milled lumber was the mark of a prosperous man, and he had never asked whether the mark of prosperity was the same as the substance of shelter. He had raised his ceilings high because high ceilings spoke of space and ease, and he had spread his rooms wide because a great man does not live in a box. His house was a statement. The widow's house was an argument. And the winter, which read neither statements nor arguments, but only the cold language of mass and air and heat, was coming to settle the difference between them in the only court that mattered. The valley settled into the waiting that comes before the real cold. The men hauling the last of their wood, the women putting up the last of the stores, every cabin smoking against a sky that gave less light each day. Eli Caldwell finished a granary for a family on the far side of the creek and rode home past the hail claim in the failing afternoon, and against his own intention, his eyes went to the strange low house, and he saw that the smoke from its odd chimney rose differently than any other in the valley. It did not pour. It did not billow. It rose thin and slow and steady, a pale thread climbing into the dimming air, and it troubled him because in his long experience a chimney that smoked so little belonged to a house with no fire in it, and a house with no fire in it on a December evening was a house where people had already begun to die. He drew rein and watched it a long moment, and he saw a small light moving behind one of the deep-set windows. The warm glow of a lamp carried from one room to another, and he understood that the house was not cold and dead, but living and lit, and that somehow it was doing what it was doing on almost no fire at all. The splinter in his mind drove deeper. He rode home and did not speak of it to his wife, and he slept badly again, and he told himself it meant nothing, and he did not believe himself. He had built half the valley with his own hands. He had taught Tom Whitfield to notch a corner and shown the men at the post how to chink a wall against the wind, and the whole of his standing among them rested on the unspoken certainty that no one knew building better than Eli Caldwell. To entertain the thought that a widow with no name in the territory, a woman who had appeared from nowhere with a dead husband's tools, might have built something he could not understand and would not have dared to attempt, was to pull a thread that ran through the center of who he believed himself to be. So he did not pull it. He pushed it down as he had pushed it down since the day she told him the air was the insulation. And he went on about his work, and he waited for the cold to prove him right, because the cold had always proven him right before. He did not yet understand that he was waiting for the one winter that would prove him wrong, and that when it came, it would not knock politely. It would come down out of the north like a judgment, and it would test every wall in the valley to its foundations, and it would have no mercy for a man's good name, or a merchant's fine glass, or a widow's stubborn hope. It would simply ask the one question the cold always asks, which is whether a house can keep the living from joining the dead, and it would accept no answer but the truth. Mina felt it coming the way she had been taught to feel it in the slant of the light and the iron taste of the air, and a stillness across the plains that was not peace but the held breath before a blow. She brought the children inside as the early dark came down, and she barred the heavy door, and she stood a moment with her back against the warm stone of the inner wall, and let it give its heat into her tired spine, the way her father's wall had given it on a winter evening in another life. Ada and Sam played on the raised floor where no cold river ran, and the small fire breathed its slow breath through the lungs she had built it, and the great body of the house held the warmth of the day like a hand closed gently around a coal. She did not know if it would be enough. She knew only that she had built it true with her own hands, and her husband's knowledge, and her father's voice in her ears, and that whatever the winter brought, she had not failed for want of trying, and her children would not freeze for want of a mother who would not stop. Outside, the wind began to rise. It came first as a low moan along the eaves, the sound a person could almost mistake for the settling of the house, and then it sharpened, climbing the register toward a thin and rising wail that spoke of distances the mind could not hold, of empty miles to the north, where the air was gathering itself into a fist. In every cabin in the valley, the families heard it and drew closer to their fires and fed them higher, and the wood crackled and gave its quick, faithless heat and asked for more, and the cold pressed its face against the chinked walls and waited. In one squat house of stone, a widow listened to the same wind and did not feed her fire higher because she did not need to, and she gathered her children into the deep, even warmth of the only thing she had left to believe in. And she waited for the morning, and she did not know that the days to come would bring the worst cold the territory had ever recorded, nor that before they ended the most respected man in the valley would stand at her door with the frost cracking in his beard and the whole of his certainty dying in his chest. The morning of the first day broke without a sun. There was light of a kind, a flat gray seepage that came from everywhere and nowhere, but the disk that should have hung in the east was only a paler smear behind a sky the color of dirty wool. At the trading post 16 miles distant, the thermometer on the porch post read 30 degrees above zero when the storekeeper unbarred his door a cold day. But an honest one, the sort of cold a person could work in if they kept moving. By the time the same man lit his lamp against the early dark, the mercury had fallen to 15 below, and the wind had begun to come up out of the north with a voice that climbed and would not stop climbing. The old hands among the settlers had a name for what they felt in their teeth, and the soles of their feet a name born on the high plains and carried down through hard memory. They called it the Blue Norther, and they said it the way a person says the name of a thing that has killed people they knew. In the Hale house, the change announced itself not as alarm, but as a deepening of the quiet. Mina felt the pressure shift against her ears in the night woke before her children lay still in the warm dark, listening to the wind find the corners of the stone. She rose without a candle, for she knew the shape of every room by the labor that had made it, and she laid a single split log on the coals that had held through the night, and the small fire took it without complaint. She did not build it higher. The great body of the house had drunk its warmth through the day before, and given it back slow through the hours of dark, so that the inner wall under her palm was not cold, but held the faint living heat of a sleeping animal, and the air in the room sat still and even untroubled by the river of frozen wind that was beginning to scour the prairie outside. She stood a long moment with her hand flat against the stone, the way her father had taught her to listen to a wall, and what she felt steadied her more than any prayer. The Whitfields, a mile and a quarter to the east, woke to a different morning. Tom had banked the stove high before he slept, and still the cabin had gone cold enough by dawn that the water in the bucket wore a skin of ice, and the baby's cough had deepened to a wet and laboring sound that made Sarah's chest seize each time she heard it. Tom pulled on every garment he owned and went out to the woodpile, and the wind nearly took him off his feet at the threshold, and the cold reached through wool and hide and found the bones of him in the space of a breath. He came back with an armload and fed the stove until it roared and the heat poured up the chimney and into the white sky and left the room scarcely warmer than before because the heat had nowhere to lodge. The logs gave their warmth all at once and faithlessly, the way the widow's father had said they would in a country neither the widow's father nor Tom Whitfield had ever shared. Sarah held the child against the small furnace of her own body and watched the frost crawl up the north wall in a pattern like the veins of a frozen leaf, and she remembered what she had said to Tom weeks before, and he had waved away, and she said it again now, and this time he did not wave it away. He only stared at the wall and fed the fire and felt for the first time the cold finger of a doubt he could not afford. By the close of the first day, the wind had become a living adversary, a thing with weight and will, and the settlers had stopped pretending it was weather. It drove between the chinked logs of the best-built cabins and stood the lamp flames sideways. It found the window frames that Eli Caldwell's own hands had set and shrieked around them in a register that set teeth on edge and would not let the mind rest. Families that had laid by what they believed was an ample store of wood watched it diminish with a speed that turned belief to fear, the careful stacks of late summer melting into ash at a rate that promised an empty woodshed long before the thaw. The temperature went down through the evening like a stone through still water, 20 below. Then further, in the second morning, brought a reading that the storekeeper noted in his ledger with a hand that shook from more than cold. 29 degrees below zero, and the wind unabated, and the snow no longer falling so much as flying. A horizontal river of white that erased the world beyond a wagon's length. In Harlan Brooks's great lumber house, the cold conducted a slow and methodical siege, and the merchant met it the only way he knew, with money turned to fuel. He had freighted out more cordwood than any family in the valley, certain that a man of means need never want for warmth, and he fed his several fires with the open hand of someone who had never been taught the difference between abundance and security. But his house had been built to be seen, and a house built to be seen is full of the things that betray it. In a hard freeze, the wide windows of deer glass, through which the warmth fled like water from a cracked jar, the high ceilings that drew the heat up and away from the people who needed it, the broad rooms that no fire could fill. His wife and his two near-grown children gathered into the one chamber where the largest hearth stood, and they drew the heavy curtains and sat close and still, their breath smoked in the air, and still the fine glass wept frost on its inner face. Harlan stood before his roaring fire in his wool-lined coat, the richest man in the valley, and felt the cold pressing at his back even as the flames scorched his front, and a thought came to him that he pushed away with all the force of his considerable pride. The thought was that he had spent a fortune to build himself a beautiful place to freeze. Mina's children played on the raised floor of the stone house through the worst of the second day, and they did not know it was the worst because nothing in their small warm world told them so. Ada built a town of wooden blocks near the hearth, and Sam knocked it down and laughed, and Mina mended a length of harness leather at the table in her shirt sleeves, the heat of the inner wall and the slow fire, holding the room at an even warmth that no cabin in the valley could have matched with 10 times the fuel. She kept her count of the wood box the way she kept count of everything, and the count told her what she already knew in her body, that the house was using almost nothing, that the engine she had built was doing exactly what she had built it to do. There was a peace in that knowledge, but it was not a peace she could fully give herself over to because she could hear beneath the wind the thing that troubled her more than any cold. She could hear the smoke of her neighbor's desperation on the air, the thick black columns that the storm tore to rags, the signature of families burning everything they had to stay 1 hour ahead of death. She had warmth to spare, and neighbors who had none, and the wall between her certainty and their suffering was a wall she had not built and could not easily cross. For she had learned what the valley thought of her, and a woman does not walk into a storm to offer help to people who have named her house a grave. The reckoning began at the Whitfield place near the close of the second day, and it began over the baby. The child's cough had become a thing that filled the cabin, a wet, rattling labor that paused only when the small body had no strength left to make the sound, and Sarah had ceased to sleep at all. The stove ate wood as fast as Tom could carry it, and the woodpile beyond the door had shrunk to a fraction of itself, and Tom did the arithmetic in the firelight and understood that at this rate the wood would not last the storm, let alone the winter, that the storm was only beginning. He looked at his wife's gray, exhausted face and his child's blue-tinged lips, and the certainty that Eli Caldwell had built into him, along with the cabin walls cracked straight down the middle. They were doing everything right. They had the best cabin the best builder in the valley could raise, and they were losing slowly, expensively, and with their baby's life riding on the margin. Tom said the thing he had not let himself think, his voice low under the wind, so the words would not wake more fear than they carried. "We built it right, Sarah. We built it just the way Caldwell showed us. And it isn't enough." It was the first crack in the valley's faith spoken aloud in a cold cabin by a frightened young man, but it would not be the last. That second night, the wood ran lower than Tom had let himself believe it could, and he sat by the failing stove doing sums that came out the same no matter how he worked them. And the sums said that if he did not bring in more before morning, the fire would die in the deepest cold with the child already failing. There was a stand of dead timber along the creek a half-mile through the storm, and he told himself that a man who knew his own ground could find it in the dark, that the wind was at his back going out and would be in his face coming home, but that he could carry wood against a wind, that he had done harder things. He did not believe all of it, but a father does not need to believe a thing entirely to do it. He needs only to believe that the alternative is worse, and the alternative was a cold stove and a blue-lipped child and a wife who had stopped sleeping. So in the black heart of that second night, with the storm at its full and the cold near its bottom, Tom Whitfield wrapped himself in every rag and hide he owned and told Sarah he would be back before the fire died, and he went out into the white roaring nothing with an axe and a length of rope and the desperate arithmetic of a man who has run out of options. Sarah stood at the door with the baby against her chest and watched the storm swallow him within 10 paces, and then there was only the wind and the cough of the child and the slow dying of the last coals, and a fear so large it had no edges. He did not come back before the fire died. He did not come back at all. The third day came, if a thing so unlike a day could be called by that name, and with it, the cold reached down to the bottom of the territory's memory and kept going. The official measure at the railroad depot, 16 miles off, recorded 43 degrees below zero, and the wind blew at the strength of a gale, so that the air itself became a weapon that flayed any inch of exposed skin in under a minute and seared the lungs of anyone who drew it too deep. The trees along the distant creek cracked like rifle fire as the frozen sap split them from within. No living thing moved upon the open prairie that a person could see, for nothing that wished to keep living would venture into it. This was no longer a winter that families would remember. It was a winter that would be remembered for them, recounted to children not yet born, as the year the cold came down like the end of the world, and asked every soul in the valley a single question with no soft answers. And it was into the first gray light of that third and bitterest day that the word of Tom's leaving spread past from a neighbor who had braved the few hundred yards to check on the young family and found Sarah half mad with terror, and the baby failing, and Tom gone into the white since the dark of the night before. A man was lost in the blue norther, a young father with a wife and a sick child somewhere between his cabin and the creek, and the cold was 43 below, and the chance that a man could survive a single hour exposed in such air, let alone the hours Tom had already been gone, was the kind of chance no one wished to name aloud. The few who could move gathered what they could and tried against all sense to search, and the storm threw them back, and the helplessness of it spread through the scattered households like a sickness. The valley had believed in its bones that hard work and good logs and the wisdom of the fathers would carry a man through. Now a good man who had done everything right was lost in the dark, and his cabin stood cold around his family, and the old certainty that had carried the settlers this far stood revealed as the thin and brittle thing it had always been. The search, such as it could be mounted in a storm that killed, fell apart almost before it began. 3 men from the nearer claims had tied themselves together with a length of plow line and pushed out from the last cabin toward the creek where the dead timber stood, reasoning that a desperate man would have made for the nearest wood, and they had gone perhaps 200 yards before the cold drove the sense out of their limbs, and the white swallowed every landmark. And the man at the front of the rope understood that they were no longer searching for Tom Whitfield, but only trying not to join him. They turned back along their own vanishing tracks, hauling on the line to keep from losing one another, and they reached the cabin with their faces gone the color of tallow, and one of them unable to feel his hands at all, and they did not go out again. There was no shame spoken over it because every man among them knew the arithmetic. A body could not live in that air. To search was to die, and they had families of their own behind cold walls, and so they sat in the failing warmth and listened to the storm and did not look at one another. Each of them carrying the private knowledge that a neighbor was dying in the dark a few hundred yards away, and that there was nothing in their power or their wisdom that could reach him. The helplessness of it was a thing the valley had never tasted not like this. These were people who had broken sod with their hands and buried their own dead and faced down prairie fires and the loneliness of a country with no edges, and they had borne all of it on the strength of a simple faith that a person who worked hard and built well and trusted the ways handed down would be carried through. That faith had a crack in it now, and the crack ran through every cabin that night, because if Tom Whitfield could do everything right and still be lost, then the doing of things right was not the shield they had believed it to be. Some of them prayed, some of them merely fed their fires and watched their woodpiles shrink and did the same cold arithmetic Tom had done before he walked out and felt the same fear rise in them. The fear not of the storm alone, but of the slow truth that the storm was uncovering, that their houses were not enough and never had been, and that they had been losing this fight by inches for years and calling the losing survival. Eli Caldwell heard of it at his own hearth, where his own family huddled in a cabin that was holding barely against a cold it had never been designed to defy, and the news struck him in a place no cold could reach. He had built the Whitfield cabin. He had taught Tom Whitfield to swing an axe and notch a log and trust the walls he raised. He had given that young man the confidence to believe his family was safe, and that confidence had sent Tom into a storm to feed a fire that should never have needed so much feeding. And now the young man was gone into the white, and his child was dying. And the fault, however, a man might parse, it ran back through the clean notched corners of a cabin to the hands that had built it and the wisdom that had guided them. The respected builder sat in the firelight of his own straining house and felt the foundations of his life shift beneath him, and he turned over the things he had been refusing to turn over since autumn. And the worst of them rose now to the surface and would not be pushed down again. For if his wisdom had failed Tom Whitfield, then his wisdom had failed all of them. And if his wisdom had failed all of them, then the strange thing the widow had built, the thing he had ridden out to condemn, the thing he had warned the whole valley against, might not have been folly at all. The thought led him by an unbearable path to a place he had refused to look. He had told Mina Hale that her stone walls would weep and freeze, that her hollow void would pour cold through her house, that she would deliver her children into a tomb. What if he had been wrong? Worse, far worse. What if he had been right in a way he had not intended? What if the house had failed as he predicted the stone sweating ice in the killing cold, and the widow and her 2 small children were even now succumbing in the very fortress she had labored to raise frozen in the dark, while the valley that had laughed at her went on believing she had only gotten what her stubbornness deserved. He had offered his counsel, been refused, and ridden away satisfied with his superior understanding, and he had not gone back to check on her once, not once through the whole of the descending cold. The remorse took him by the throat. A man could lose Tom Whitfield to a storm and call it the storm's doing. But to lose a widow and 2 children to a thing a man might have prevented to a thing a man had instead condemned, that was a weight Eli Caldwell did not think he could carry. He sat with it through the worst hours of that morning, and somewhere in those hours, the remorse turned into something a man could act upon, which is the only mercy remorse ever offers. He could not search for Tom Whitfield in the open, and live no man could, and the knowing of that was its own wound. But the Hale claim lay less than a mile distant by a path he knew, and if there was any chance that the widow and her children still drew breath in that house of stone, then he would carry them. What help a man could carry, and if there was no chance, if the house had become what he had warned it would become, then he would at least know the truth of what his certainty had done, and he would carry that too, because a man who will not look at the cost of his own pride has no business calling himself a builder of anything. He wrapped himself in every length of wool, in every scrap of hide his house could spare, until he was a shapeless thing that could barely bend its arms. His wife looked at him as though he had lost his reason, and perhaps he had. But she saw the set of his jaw and did not try to hold him, and she put a flask of hot broth wrapped in flannel against his chest and barred the door behind him. Then Eli Caldwell stepped out into the blue norther, and the storm took him the way it had taken Tom Whitfield. And he learned in the first 3 steps that everything he had ever believed about cold had been the belief of a man who had never truly been inside it. The wind was not wind, it was a wall, a solid pressure that drove him backward and bent him double and made each forward step a thing he had to win by force. The cold did not bite, it consumed. It reached through every layer he had wrapped himself in and laid its hand directly on the living heat of him, and began methodically to draw that heat away. The snow flew so hard it was less like falling water than like flung sand, a blasting white that scoured his face and packed itself into every crease of his clothing. His beard froze solid in under a minute, the moisture of his own breath turning to a mask of ice across his lower face, and his eyelashes gathered frost so quickly that he had to claw it away with a stiffening glove every few steps to keep his sight at all. The world had become a howling white chaos, with no up and no down and no direction a man could trust. And the path he knew as well as his own hand had vanished utterly, so that he navigated by memory and stubbornness, staggering from one half-remembered landmark to the next, a fence post. Here the dark hump of a buried plow there, each one a small miracle that he had not yet wandered off into the trackless white to die. He had thought he knew cold. He had spent a quarter-century building shelter against it, had worked through winters that froze the nails. In his pouch had prided himself on a hardiness that let him labor when other men quit. All of that was the knowledge of a man who had always had a warm place to return to, and the storm stripped it from him in the first minute and showed him a cold that had no bottom and no mercy and no interest at all in how hard a man had worked. Twice his sense of direction left him entirely, and he stood turning in the white, with his heart hammering, certain he had wandered off the path into the open prairie, where a man walks in circles until he lies down, and twice some half-buried shape resolved out of the chaos at the last possible moment and gave him back his bearing. The flask of broth his wife had pressed against his chest had frozen solid. The exposed strip of his face between hat and collar had gone past pain into a dead waxen numbness that he knew was the beginning of the thing that took fingers and noses and lives. More than once, the cold made its reasonable argument, the argument it makes to every man it kills, which is that he should stop just for a moment, just to gather his strength, that the storm was too much and the distance too far, and that no one would blame him for turning back to the warmth he had left. More than once, Eli Caldwell nearly listened. What drove him forward against that seductive voice was not his own survival, for he had half ceased to care about that, but the image that rose behind his frozen eyes each time he faltered, the image of 2 small children, a girl and a boy, he had seen stacking stone chips in the autumn light, sealed inside a fortress of ice, while the valley slept in its certainty. He could not turn back from that. He had turned back from too much already. So he leaned into the wall of wind and put one numb foot in front of the other and went on deeper into the white, until at last, when his strength had worn down to the last frayed thread of it, he saw the shape. It was low and indistinct against the blinding storm, half drowned in a drift that had piled against its northern flank, and it looked more like an outcropping of the earth itself than anything a person had made. The Hale House. And as Caldwell stumbled toward it through the last brutal yards, the thing he saw, or rather did not see, stopped the breath in his frozen chest. There was no frantic column of smoke. He had braced himself through the whole desperate crossing for one of two sights, either a dead chimney over a frozen tomb, or a furious black billow of a family burning the last of everything to stave off the end. He saw neither. The smoke that rose from the strange winding chimney was thin, almost languid, a quiet and steady thread of pale vapor that climbed into the heart of the screaming storm as calmly as breath from a sleeping creature. It made no sense. It defied every law he had built his life upon. A house in this cold should be roaring its fires, or it should be dead. And this house was doing neither. This house was breathing slow and easy and untroubled in the teeth of a storm that had killed a strong young man not a mile away. He half fell against the heavy door, his body past the point where it could be made to do much more, and he beat his frozen glove against the timber, and the sound of it was swallowed whole by the gale. He waited and heard nothing. He struck again harder, dredging up a shout from somewhere below the ice that sealed his face, and this time the door gave inward, and Eli Caldwell met not a gust nor a draft, nor any natural thing but a wave of warmth, silent and steady and gold, that rolled out over the threshold and broke against the dying cold of him, and began instantly to undo it. It melted the ice from his beard and set a fierce, stinging life prickling across his frozen face, and it carried to him impossibly in the middle of a killing storm the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke, and a thing he had not expected and could not at first name, which was the smell of ordinary life going peacefully on. He staggered across the threshold and shouldered the great door shut against the storm, and his sight failed him for a moment as his eyes labored to find their way from the blinding chaos outside to the warm, dim calm within, and then his vision cleared, and what he saw was so completely impossibly ordinary that it struck him harder than any wonder could have. The widow's children were playing on the floor. The girl Ada had built a small town of wooden blocks, and the boy Sam sat beside her in nothing but a thin shirt, and both of them were barefoot. Barefoot on a stone floor on the third day of a cold that had frozen a man to death within sight of his own door. Mina Hale sat at a plain table in her shirt sleeves, a length of leather across her knees, and near the hearth. Her work of the morning still scented the air, and the fire itself was no inferno, but a small and modest thing. Two split lengths of wood burning low and even and untroubled. Eli Caldwell stood dripping melting frost onto the spotless floor, the most respected builder in the valley, and his mind could not make the evidence of his eyes agree with the whole of his understanding, and the gap between the two yawned open like the storm at his back. There was no frost on any inner surface. The small, deep windows held clear, showing only the white fury raging beyond the thick stone. He could feel the heat radiating not merely from the modest fire, but from the very walls themselves, a deep and even and living warmth that came up out of the stone as though the rock had drunk a summer's sun and was giving it back into the dark. He pulled the glove from one hand, and with a sensation close to dread, he laid his bare palm flat against the inner masonry. And it was not cold, it was not even neutral. It was warm, warm as a hearthstone in the lingering hours of a summer evening, a profound and penetrating heat that poured out of the rock and into the chilled bones of his hand and traveled up his arm like a benediction he had not earned. Everything he knew was being taken apart in this small, warm room, stone by patient stone, and he had not the means to put it back together. Mina looked up from her work, her face composed, holding no triumph and no surprise, only the steady regard of a woman who had known somewhere that the storm would bring her this. Eli, she said with a slight inclination of her head, as though a frostbitten man at her door in the worst storm in memory were the most natural thing in the world. This storm is a hard one. And Eli Caldwell, who had built half the valley and trusted the wisdom of the fathers and warned this very woman against the thing that was now saving his life, found that he had no words at all, because every word he owned belonged to a way of understanding the world that had just died in the warmth of a widow's house. And he stood in the doorway of his own ignorance and did not yet know how to walk through it. His voice came out of him broken and hoarse, The first words he had managed since the door swung wide. "Your wood," he managed, his frozen throat barely shaping it. "How much wood have you burned?" Mina rose from her table and crossed to a compact wooden box beside the hearth, and she lifted its lid, and Eli Caldwell looked into it and felt the floor of his understanding drop away entirely. The box was orderly and near three-quarters full. "I carried that in 2 days ago," she said, with no more weight than a woman remarking on the weather. "It will likely last 2 more." The arithmetic struck him with the force of a physical blow, for he did the sum without wanting to and could not unmake the answer. The Hale family had burned in 2 days of the worst cold in living memory, less wood than his own house consumed in 2 hours. And they had not merely endured it, they had lived in ease. The children at their games, the mother at her quiet work. While the man who had condemned them all stood dripping and broken and amazed in the warmth they had to spare. He moved to the hearth as though pulled, and he crouched before the small fire, and he watched it burn low and steady and patient, asking nothing. And he understood at last the thing the widow had tried to tell him in the autumn light, and he had been too certain to hear. She had not built a house to fight the cold. She had built a house to gather warmth and keep it a vessel rather than a battlefield. And the small fire was not waging a desperate war against the winter. The way his own great blaze was, it was merely topping off a reservoir that the stone walls had been filling all season long. The hollow he had mocked, the void he had called a highway for drafts, had been the very thing that held the warmth inside, separating the inner stone from the outer cold, so that the heat the family made could not flee. Every principle he had built his life upon had been not wrong exactly, but incomplete. The partial wisdom of men who had learned to fight a battle they could have avoided fighting altogether. And the woman who had seen the deeper truth of it had been standing in front of him for 3 months, while he and the whole valley called her a fool. He stayed crouched at the fire a long while, and Mina let him because she understood that a man whose certainties have just collapsed needs time to learn how to stand in the rubble. When at last he rose and turned to face her, his face had the rawness of a man who has wept without tears, and the words came hard because they were the heaviest. A proud and respected man can say an admission of a failure, so total that it shook the foundation of everything he had been. "Mina," he said, and his voice held steady through effort rather than ease, "I made a mistake." He paused, and the warmth of the room pressed in around the silence, and he made himself finish it because half an admission was no admission at all. "This house is no fool's errand. It is a wonder. I was wrong about all of it." And then he asked her the question that cost him the last of his pride and bought him the beginning of his wisdom. "Will you teach me how it works?" But even as the words left him, even as Mina opened her mouth to answer, the thought of his own family rose in him, and behind it, the thought of Sarah Whitfield and her dying child, and the warmth of the stone house turned in an instant from a wonder into a rebuke. Because what good was a miracle of shelter that he alone had stumbled into, while the people he loved froze in the houses he had built them? The reckoning was not finished. It had only changed its shape. He had crossed a killing storm to find the truth, and now the truth demanded he carry it back out into that same storm to the people who needed it. And he did not yet know how a man half dead from the crossing could possibly make the journey again, nor whether there would be anyone left alive at the end of it to save. He told her of Tom then in a few broken words, that the young man was lost in the white, and the search had failed, and that Sarah and the baby were alone in a cabin that by now would have no fire at all. He watched the knowledge land in her, watched her own face go to the place his had been, and he saw that she had heard something of it already, that the not knowing what to do had been its own torment to her through the long hours. The decision did not need much speaking aloud. Eli Caldwell saw the resolve form in the widow's face the moment he named the Whitfields, and Mina saw the same resolve harden in his, and the two of them stood in the warm dim of the stone house as two people who had just agreed without a single word of argument to walk back into the thing that had nearly killed one of them. There was a child by the creek who might still draw breath, and a young mother holding it against the dark, and a roofed and waiting reservoir of warmth that could save them both if only the distance between could be crossed. Mina banked the fire so it would hold for the children, and she woke Ada with a hand on the shoulder and told her in the low, steady voice she used when a thing was serious that she and Mr. Caldwell were going to bring the Whitfield family in from the cold, and that Ada was to mind her brother and keep the door barred until she heard her mother's voice. The girl's eyes went wide with a fear too old for 7 years, and Mina pressed her daughter's small face between her hands, and gave her the only promise a mother could honestly give in such an hour. "I built these walls to keep you," she said. "They will keep you while I am gone. Mind the fire low. I will come back." And the girl, who had spent a whole autumn learning to do what was needed without being asked twice, swallowed her fear and nodded and took her brother's hand, and Mina turned from the hardest leaving she had ever done and put her mind to the storm. They went out together into a wind that had not softened, and the cold met them at the threshold like a creditor come to collect. But they went out better armed than Tom Whitfield had been, for they went with a rope between them and a sled at Caldwell's back, and the knowledge of exactly where they were going. Even so, the crossing was a horror that tested the bottom of them both. The wind drove the breath back down their throats, and the snow flayed every inch of skin it could find. And Mina, who had not been out in the worst of it before this, learned in the first 100 yards the truth that Caldwell had learned coming the other way, that this was a cold with no floor to it, a cold that wished to kill and required no malice to do so. She had built a house that could stand against this thing, and she had believed she understood it, and she found now that understanding a cold from inside warm walls and meeting it in the open were two different kinds of knowledge entirely, and that the second kind could kill you while you were still admiring the first. They navigated by the line of a fence she half remembered, and the slope of the land beneath their feet, hauling on the rope to keep from losing each other in the white. And twice the sled fouled in a drift and cost them strength they could not spare. And once Mina went down to her knees in a hollow and felt the seductive warmth that is the cold's last lie steal up through her, that false and fatal ease that tells a freezing body it may rest now. Caldwell hauled her upright by the rope and put his frozen face close to hers and shouted the only thing that mattered. "Not yet," he said. "There is a child." And she found her feet again on the strength of it, because she had her own children waiting behind warm walls, and she would not leave them motherless to adrift in the dark, and the two of them pushed on toward the failing cabin by the creek. There was a moment near the worst of it when Mina understood with a clarity that the cold could not touch, that she might die out here, that the house she had built to save her children might orphan them instead, because their mother had walked into a storm for the sake of a neighbor who had never laughed at her, and she found that she could not regret the choosing. Even so, that a warmth hoarded while a child froze nearby was not a warmth she could have lived behind, and she put her head down and went on. They reached the cabin in the gray that was beginning at last to thin towards something like a true day, and they found the door unbarred, which was its own kind of dread, for an unbarred door in such cold meant either that someone had gone out or that no one inside had the strength left to secure it. Caldwell shouldered it open, and the cold inside the cabin was scarcely different from the cold without the stove. Long dead, the air gone bitter and still. And on the bed in the corner, under a heap of every covering the house possessed, lay Sarah Whitfield, and she did not move when the door crashed wide. For one black instant, Mina believed they had come too late for both of them. Then the heap stirred, and Sarah's face turned toward the gray light, hollow and barely living, and from the bundle against her chest came a sound thin and reedy and unspeakably welcome, the cough of a child not yet surrendered. They lived, the two of them, by the narrowest margin the cold allowed, the mother having given every degree of her own warmth to the small body she sheltered, and they had perhaps an hour left in them, no more, when the door blew open on a widow and a builder come walking out of a storm that should have killed them. Sarah's cracked lips shaped a word that was not for either of her rescuers. "Tom," she breathed, the whole of her hope and grief packed into the single syllable, and Mina understood in that instant that the young woman did not yet know, had spent the night and the day believing her husband might still come through that door, and that there was no time now to tell her the truth, and no kindness in it either. "We have a warm house," Mina said, gathering the question of Tom into a silence she would carry for the both of them, "and you and the child are coming to it now." They wrapped Sarah and the baby in the robes from the sled, working fast against the cold that was already finding the gaps their entry had opened, and Caldwell lifted the young mother, who weighed almost nothing in her depletion, and they bound the bundle of her to the sled and turned back into the wind that now mercifully came at their backs and helped to drive them home. The return was its own ordeal, the added weight, the failing strength of two people already spent, but the cold that had been their enemy on the crossing out became, with the wind behind them, a hand at their shoulders, and they staggered the last yards to the squat stone house as the storm at last began almost imperceptibly to loosen its grip upon the world. Ada's voice came small and frightened through the barred door when Mina called, And then the bar scraped back, and the warmth of the house rolled out over the half-frozen company on the threshold, the way it had rolled over Caldwell hours before. And it was to Sarah Whitfield surfacing from a night spent waiting to die, a thing beyond her understanding. They carried her in and laid her near the hearth, and they unwrapped the child and set her against the warm stone, and the small body that had been losing its heat by the hour began in the deep, even warmth of that impossible house to gather it back. Sarah lay on the floor, where no cold river ran her cheek against the warm rock, and she wept, the tears thawing on a face that had forgotten how to make them, and the baby's cough eased by slow degrees into the easier breathing of a child who would, after all, see the morning. Ada brought a cup of broth without being told, and held it to the young mother's lips, and Sam, who understood only that there were new people, and that his mother had come back, climbed into Mina's lap, and held on as though to keep her from ever leaving again. The valley had lost a man to the storm that night. It would not lose his wife and his child, because a woman it had named a fool had built a vessel of warmth, and a man it had trusted had crossed a killing dark twice to fill it. The storm broke before noon of that third day, the way such storms do, all at once, the wind dropping from its scream to a sigh, and the flying snow settling, and the flat gray sky cracking open to let through a thin, hard winter sun that lay across the drifted world like a blessing, arriving too late for some and just in time for others. The valley crept out of its cabins into a landscape remade, the snow piled in long sculpted waves, the cold still bitter, but no longer murderous, and the survivors counted themselves and their stores and their losses, and the losses were heavy. Tom Whitfield was found 2 days later when the drifts had settled enough for a search no more than 400 yards from his own door, where he had gone down within sight of the home he was trying to save, and the cold had taken him quietly, as it took everyone, with no drama and no mercy. He had reached the creek by the look of it, for there was a little cut wood lashed to his back, and he had been carrying it home when his strength gave out 400 yards short in his own field, with the wood that might have saved his family still on his shoulders. They buried him in the spring, when the ground at last gave way to the spade, and the bearing of him sat at the center of everything that followed, a grief that no warmth could undo, the price the valley paid for the wisdom it had refused. Sarah did not weep at the graveside. She had done her weeping on a warm stone floor in the dark of the storm. She stood with her child on her hip and watched them lower the man who had walked into the white for her, and she made a vow that no one heard, which was that her daughter would never sleep a winter in a house that could not hold its warmth, and she kept that vow to the end of her days. But the wife and the child lived, and they lived in the stone house through the worst of the remaining winter. And the fact of their living became the first thread of a story that would unravel everything the valley believed about how a person ought to build. For Sarah Whitfield, restored to herself over the warm days that followed, could not stop telling what she had seen. She told of waking from a night spent waiting for death to find herself in a room where the walls themselves gave warmth, where a sick child mended on a stone floor, where a small fire did the work that her own roaring stove had failed to do. And the people who heard it could not square it with what they knew, and they came at first in disbelief to see for themselves. They came across the settling snow with the wariness of people approaching a thing they have mocked, and they stood in the warm dim of the widow's house and laid their own bare hands against the inner wall the way Caldwell had. And they felt the stone give back its hoarded heat, and they went home changed, each of them carrying the small heavy seed of a question that would grow through the rest of that winter into a certainty. Harlan Brooks was among them, though he came last, and he came changed, for the storm had done to him in private what it had done to Caldwell in the open. His family had survived it but barely, and the surviving had cost him every stick of the wood he had so proudly freighted out. And worse than the wood, it had cost him the one thing a man like Harlan valued above money, which was his certainty in his own judgment. He had sat through the worst of the cold in the finest house in the valley and watched his fortune fail to buy him safety, and the failing had planted in him a question he could not stop asking, which was what good was a thing built to be admired if it could not keep a child from freezing. He rode out to the hail claim when the roads allowed, and he sat his horse before the squat stone house he had mocked, and he looked at the thin, steady smoke rising from its winding chimney, and he understood at last that the widow had not built a poor woman's house out of necessity. She had built a wise woman's house out of knowledge, and his own grand dwelling, for all its glass and height and milled lumber, had been the truly poor thing all along. Poor in the only currency the winter recognized. He dismounted, which the valley would remark on after, for Harlan Brooks did not often come down to anyone's level, and he stood before Mina Hale with his hat in his hands and made the merchant's mistake one final time, because it was the only language he truly knew. He offered to buy it. He offered her a sum that would have lifted her and her children out of want for years, a sum she could not have dreamed of standing in her sod burrow in the autumn, in exchange for the secret of the house, the right to build such houses and sell them. The method made his property. He spoke of it as a business arrangement that would benefit them both, a fortune for her and a fortune for him. And he believed as he said it, that he was being generous, that he was finally giving the widow her due, that he was offering her the very deliverance from want that he had once offered as charity work in his kitchen. Mina listened to the whole of it, and she did not answer at once. And when she did, her voice held no anger, only the flat, quiet certainty that had unsettled every man who had ever heard it. "You want to buy the warmth," she said, "so that you can sell it back to the people who are freezing." She let that sit in the cold air between them. "My husband did not teach me this so it could be locked in a strong box. My father did not press my hand to a warm wall so I could put a price on it. There is a man in the ground by the creek who might be alive if this knowledge had been a thing the valley shared instead of a thing it laughed at, and I will not be the one to make it dear." And then she said the thing that ended the matter, the thing that drew the line between what Harlan Brooks was and what she was, clean and final. "I will teach it to anyone who comes to learn. It costs nothing. It was never mine to sell." Harlan Brooks had no answer for it, because there was no answer a man of his kind could make to a thing offered freely that he had tried to buy. He put his hat back on his head, and he mounted his horse, and he rode home to his cold grand house. And somewhere on the ride, the last of his contempt curdled into something he had never felt toward anyone, which was a reluctant and unwilling respect. He would build again the following season a smaller house, a denser house, a house with thick walls and small windows, and a fire that asked little of him, and he would never quite admit to anyone that he had learned it from a widow. He had once offered charity work, but he would build it and his family would be warm in it. And that was its own kind of confession, written in stone where words would not come. He sent her that spring a wagon load of seasoned lumber and a side of cured pork with no note and no explanation. And Mina understood it for what it was and accepted it for what it was. And the two of them never spoke of the matter again, which was the nearest thing to an apology a man like Harlan Brooks had in him to give. So began the great unlearning of the valley, and at the center of it stood Mina Hale, who had never asked to be at the center of anything. The men who had laughed came now with their hats in their hands and their questions ready, and she met them not with the triumph she had earned and might have been forgiven for taking, but with the plain generosity of someone who had only ever wanted her neighbors to stop dying in houses that could not hold their warmth. She walked them through the principle of the double wall, the outer mass to gather the heat, the packed hollow to hold it, the inner mass to give it back. She showed them the winding flue that made the smoke surrender its warmth to the stone before it fled, and she made them light a handful of grass and watch the draw the way her father had taught her to test a flue, so that they would understand it with their eyes and not only their ears. She explained the raised floor and the buried duct that fed the fire, warmed air instead of letting a frozen river pour across the room. She did not gloat, and she did not remind them of the name they had given her house, and she did not once say that she had told them so, because the satisfaction she took was not in being proven right, but in the certainty that the next winter would find fewer children huddled in the small ring of warmth around a failing stove. There was an old man among the first to come, a hard and grizzled homesteader named Pruitt, who had been among the loudest at the post and the surest that the widow was a fool. And he stood in her doorway with his hat crushed in his big hands and could not at first bring himself to ask his question. And Mina saw the struggle in him and made it easy, telling him to sit and warming a cup for him and explaining the walls as though he had never said a hard word in his life. When he left, he stopped at the door and turned and said gruffly that he was sorry for the things he had said, and Mina told him that the cold had said worse to all of them and that they could let it go now. And the old man went home and built a stone house with his sons and lived in it warm for 20 years. And at the end of his life, he told his grandsons that the wisest person he had ever known was a widow. He had once mocked, and that a man should be slow to laugh at what he does not understand, because the thing he laughs at may one day be the thing that keeps his children alive. Eli Caldwell became her first and finest student, and the becoming of it was a thing that healed something in him that the storm had broken. The carpenter's mind, once freed from the confines of the wisdom he had trusted too long, took to the new principles with the hunger of a man making up for lost time. And he brought to them a thing the widow's craft had lacked, which was his own deep mastery of timber and joinery. Between the two of them, over the seasons that followed, a new kind of dwelling took shape in the valley. Neither the widow's heavy stone fortress, nor the old man's failing log box, but a marriage of the two, simpler to raise than solid masonry, yet built around the same hard truth that warmth was a thing to be gathered and kept rather than made and lost. They built the first of them together in the spring on the Whitfield claim for Sarah, and the child raised over the same ground where Tom would lie when the earth softened, so that the young widow and her daughter would never again face a winter in a house that could not hold them. Caldwell laid the timbers and Mina set the stone, and the two of them worked side by side without the need for many words. Two people who had crossed a killing storm together and come out the far side, knowing exactly what they had built and exactly why it mattered. Sarah carried mortar for them and learned the work as she carried it. And in the years to come, she would build such houses herself and teach others, so that the knowledge that had saved her flowed on through her hands into the hands of strangers she would never meet. The change came slowly to the valley, as true change does, one house at a time over several seasons, but its effect ran deep. The new dwellings which the people took to calling Hale houses without irony now altered the very nature of what winter meant. A season that had been a thing to be endured, a grim attrition of fuel and warmth and well-being, became something a family could live through rather than merely survive. There was more wood left for other needs because the houses asked so little of it. There was more ease, more rest, fewer of the long nights spent feeding a hungry fire that gave nothing lasting back. The well-being of the whole community lifted, and fewer children sickened in the cold months, and the fear that had ridden every family from first frost to thaw loosened its grip a little more with each new house that rose. Men who had reckoned their winters by how much wood they could cut began to reckon them instead by how much they could leave standing. And the woodlots along the creek, which had been stripped near to ruin in the hard years, began slowly to recover, so that the very land healed a little under the new wisdom. The true measure of it, though, was not a thing that could be counted in cords of wood, saved, or degrees held against the cold. It was measured in dignity. It was the ability of a family to use the whole of its house in January instead of crowding into the narrow band of warmth around the stove. It was the security of knowing the fuel would last until the spring thaw, that no father would have to walk out into a blue norther for one more armload of wood. It was the long winter evenings a family could spend in comfort instead of misery, the mending and the reading and the talk that warmth makes possible and cold makes impossible. The whole ordinary life of a household that the old way had crushed down into a grim huddle and the new way set free. There came an evening late in that first winter, after the storm and the rescue and the slow beginning of the unlearning, when Eli Caldwell sat at the widow's table with a cup of something hot between his weathered hands, and he said the thing that had been forming in him since the night he laid his bare palm against a warm stone wall and felt his life come apart. The whole of his standing in the valley had rested on the certainty that no one understood building better than he did, and the storm had stripped that certainty from him, and he had expected to mourn it, and found instead that he did not. "We spent all those years fighting the cold," he said, watching the small steady fire. "Fighting it like it was a thing we could beat by working harder, burning more, building tighter." He turned the cup in his hands. "You never fought it at all." And Mina, who was mending by the hearth in her shirt sleeves while her children slept warm in the next room, answered without looking up, in the soft mountain cadence that the valley had once mistaken for the speech of a simpleton. "You cannot beat the winter," she said. "You can only stop fighting it long enough to learn what it is teaching you." The years carried the valley forward as years do, and the stone houses and their hybrid cousins spread out across that stretch of territory, until a traveler passing through would have remarked on the strange low dwellings that hugged the ground, and would have been told if he asked that they were Hale houses, and that they kept a family warm on a fraction of the fuel the old cabins ate. Ada grew tall in the warmth her mother had built, and she learned the stone as her mother had learned it. Her small, cold hands of the building summer become the strong, sure hands of a young woman who could read the way a slab wanted to lie. She would carry the craft into the next century, raising warm houses for families her grandfather in the Blue Hills of West Virginia had never imagined. And when her own children asked her how she had come to know such things, She would tell them about a summer when the wagons slowed on the road to watch, and a storm that came down like the end of the world, and a mother who would not stop. Sam grew up with no memory of the fear at all, only of a warm house and a brave mother and a winter when a strange man came out of the snow and never left their lives again. For Eli, Caldwell remained a fixture at the Hale table for as long as he lived. The old carpenter and the widow Mason bound by a storm into a friendship that the whole valley came to take for granted. Mina Hale never grew rich and she never grew famous beyond the borders of that one stretch of territory, and she did not wish to. She remained what she had always been, a stonemason, a widow, a mother, a woman whose hands carried the marks of her trade, and whose certainty had been forged in the hills of a country she would not see again. She kept the promise made to a dying man under a cottonwood tree, gave her children the hearth and the windows both, and watched them grow strong in the warmth of it. And if that was the whole of her reward, it was reward enough, for it was the only reward she had ever wanted. Harlan Brooks, who had offered to buy her secret, lived out his days in his quieter second house, and learned late and grudgingly that the things most worth having are precisely the things that cannot be bought, that a man may freight glass and lumber from the ends of the earth and still lack the one wall that will keep his children warm. Eli Caldwell built Hale houses for the rest of his working life and told anyone who would listen that the finest builder he had ever known was a widow. He had once ridden out to call a fool, and the telling of it cost him nothing and gave him a peace he had not expected, the peace of a man who has looked squarely at his own pride and lived past it. The houses she taught the valley to build outlasted all of them. They stood low and unassuming against the Dakota wind through winters beyond counting, squat and homely and warm, and they served as a quiet monument to a woman who had listened to the wisdom of an older world and carried it across a continent and a grave to build fortresses of warmth where her neighbors saw only piles of despised stone. The principles beneath Hale's folly were never mysterious, and they are not mysterious now. What the widow raised on that quarter section was a highly insulated structure of great thermal mass, fitted with a system that recovered the heat of its own breath, and the same principles govern the warmest and most efficient homes built in this country in the present day, though the materials have changed. We use foam where she used moss glass of 3 panes, where she used a single engineered exchangers, where she shaped a duct beneath a raised floor. The substance is different. The truth underneath it has not moved an inch. Warmth is a thing to be gathered into the body of a house and held there against the dark, and the keeping of it remains one of the surest ways ever found to raise a dwelling that is at once a comfort to live in and a mercy upon the fuel that feeds it. The story of Mina Hale endured in that country long after the woman herself was gone, told and retold beside the very hearths her wisdom had warmed, and the heart of it was always the same. It was the memory of a door swinging open on the worst day the territory had ever known, of a wave of gold warmth rolling out into a killing cold, of a small fire that did the work of an inferno, and a wall that gave back the sun it had drunk in summer, and of a woman in her shirt sleeves who had built all of it with her own 2 hands while the valley laughed. There is a kind of knowledge, the story said, that the world will mock right up until the moment it saves a life, and there is a kind of person who will carry that knowledge through scorn and grief and the indifference of their neighbors because they understand as the proud and the comfortable. Do not that the measure of a shelter is not how it looks to the people passing on the road, but how it holds the ones you love when the dark comes down and the cold comes hunting, and there is nowhere left to run but home. The most innovative answer it taught does not always arrive as a new discovery, but often as the patient reapplication of knowledge that everyone has and no one heeds. And the truest courage is not the courage to invent something new, but the courage to trust what you know to be true when the whole of the world insists that you are a fool. The account you have just heard is a work of fiction shaped for instruction and for the pleasure of the telling. And while the principles of engineering and physics at its center, the gathering of thermal mass, the breaking of cold through insulation, the patient storage of passive heat are entirely true and have been applied in building both old and new. The people and the places and the events within it are the creations of an imagined tale offered as a plain and human illustration of an idea worth remembering.